Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be tackling student assessment, but not the kind that makes you want to, run for the hills.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about how assessment can actually help students learn
Yeah.
and, get ready for the future, which is a bit of a mystery box right now.
Yeah.
Our guide for this deep dive is a presentation by Professor Sam Elkington. He's an expert in assessment design. And I think, one of the things that he talks about that's really fascinating is that this traditional high-stakes assessment model we have, those big end-of-year exams, they're becoming increasingly out of sync with what the world actually needs. So
Yeah. And that's where I think, he highlights something really interesting, which is this rise of AI and how AI kind of adds this extra layer of complexity to this whole assessment question. Because some of those old school methods are almost becoming obsolete.
Right. Because if a computer can just spit out an essay in 2 seconds, why am I even bothering to memorize all these facts and figures?
Exactly. So Professor Elkington argues that this is actually a huge opportunity. Instead of, panicking about AI taking over the world, we can use this as a reason to shift our focus from just looking at the final product of learning to actually looking at the process. So it's not about, can you produce the right answer? It's about, have you developed the skills, the critical thinking skills, the problem-solving strategies, the ability to collaborate, all of these things that AI can't quite replicate yet.
So it's less about, can you write a perfect essay, and more about, can you research, analyze, and form your own, unique arguments?
Exactly. And Professor Elkington points out that there are actually 3 distinct purposes for assessment, and grades are really only one small part of that picture.
Wait, there's 3. I always thought assessment was just about being assessed.
Right. Well, that's one type. That's the assessment of learning. That's what we often call summative assessment. It's that big exam that tells you what you've learned at the end of a course. It's a snapshot in time. But there's also assessment for learning, which is also called formative assessment. And that's all about giving students feedback as they go, helping them to, see where they need to adjust and improve their work.
Oh, so instead of just getting a grade at the end, you're getting guidance the whole way through.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process. And then there's this really intriguing one called assessment as learning. And this is where students actually become participants in their own assessment. They're reflecting on their work, they're setting goals, they're figuring out how they learn best.
Whoa, self-assessment.
Yeah.
I wish I'd had more of that in school. I was always so focused on getting the A that I never really stopped to think about.
Yeah.
How I was learning or if there was a better way to do it.
And that's, that kind of metacognitive awareness is exactly what Professor Elkington's advocating for. And he uses this really cool analogy. He compares it to a stack of Swiss cheese. If you only have one slice of Swiss cheese, it's full of holes, right? Those represent the gaps in learning. But if you layer several slices together, then you get a much more solid and complete picture.
Okay. I'm definitely seeing the value of mixing things up. But how do we actually do that? How do we move beyond those single slices of Swiss cheese and create a more layered approach to assessment?
Well, that's where flexible assessment comes in. And Professor Elkington outlines kind of 3 key dimensions that make assessment more adaptable and effective. But before we dive into those, maybe let's pause for a second and just, think back to your own experiences in school. Did your assessments ever feel like they were designed for somebody else, somebody with a completely different learning style? Or did you ever kind of feel like you were just going through the motions, not really connecting with the material or understanding why it mattered?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember spending hours memorizing dates and names for history tests, but I couldn't tell you why any of it was significant or how it connected to the bigger picture.
And that disconnect is something that Professor Elkington's really trying to address with this idea of flexible assessment. And the first dimension he highlights is inclusive assessment, which means recognizing that students have diverse backgrounds, learning styles, and needs, and offering options that allow them to demonstrate their understanding in ways that work best for them.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we're talking about giving students choices right. Maybe they can write an essay or create a presentation, or even build a model to show what they've learned.
Exactly. It's about providing a buffet of options and letting students pick the ones that resonate with their strengths and interests. And it's also about making sure that assessments are accessible to all learners, regardless of any physical or learning challenges they might have.
That makes so much sense. I can see how that would make assessment feel less like a hurdle and more like an opportunity to shine. What about the second dimension?
So the second dimension is learning-focused assessment. And as the name suggests, it puts the emphasis on using assessment as a tool to enhance learning, not just measure it. This involves providing frequent and meaningful feedback throughout the process, giving students a chance to revise and improve their work.
So it's less about the final grade and more about the ongoing dialogue between teachers and students.
Exactly. It's about creating a feedback loop that helps students understand, their strengths and areas for growth, and then provides them with the support and resources they need to develop their skills. It's also about encouraging a growth mindset, where students view mistakes as opportunities for learning and improvement, rather than as failures.
Okay, I'm loving this idea of assessment as a learning journey, not just a destination. But what about the third dimension? Professor Elkington mentioned something about transparency.
Right. The third dimension is shared and transparent assessment. And this is all about demystifying the assessment process for students. It means being upfront about the criteria for success, providing examples of high-quality work, and involving students in discussions about why certain assessment methods are chosen.
It's like taking them behind the curtain and showing them how the magic trick works, right? Instead of just telling them to jump through hoops, we're explaining why those hoops are there and how they can jump through them effectively.
Exactly. When students understand the why behind assessment, they're more likely to buy into the process and feel empowered to succeed. Professor Elkington uses a great analogy to illustrate this idea. He compares it to chairs.
Chairs. Okay, this should be interesting.
So he says that standardized assessments are like mass-produced chairs. They're all identical, they're made to fit a generic mold, and they don't really take into account individual needs or preferences.
Oh, I get it. It's like those uncomfortable plastic chairs you find stacked up in a school auditorium.
They're functional, but not exactly inspiring or comfortable. Exactly. But flexible assessment, he argues, is more like handcrafted chairs. Each one is unique. It's designed with the individual user in mind, and it's made with care and attention to detail.
So instead of forcing everyone to sit in the same uncomfortable chair, we're giving them the tools and materials to build their own chairs. Chairs that fit them perfectly and support them in the way they need.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And just like a well-crafted chair can make all the difference in your posture and comfort, a well-designed assessment can make all the difference in a student's learning experience and their motivation to succeed.
I'm starting to see how these three dimensions of flexible assessment, inclusive learning, focused, and shared, can really transform the way we think about and approach assessment. But I think some listeners might be wondering, okay, this sounds great in theory, but how do we actually make it happen in the real world? Especially with this added pressure of AI constantly lurking in the background.
That's a really valid concern. And it's important to acknowledge that implementing flexible assessment is not a quick fix. It requires a shift in mindset, a willingness to experiment, and a commitment to ongoing reflection and improvement.
So where do we even begin? What are some practical steps educators can take in incorporating these principles into their teaching and assessment practices?
Well, Professor Elkington suggests starting by focusing on the learning outcomes. What are the essential skills, knowledge, and competencies that students need to develop in order to succeed in this course, in their future careers, and in life in general?
So it's about being really intentional about what we're assessing and why we're assessing it. It's not just about covering the content. It's about ensuring that students are actually developing the skills and knowledge they need to thrive.
Exactly. And once we've clarified those learning outcomes, we can start thinking about the best ways to assess them. And this is where the flexibility comes in. We can offer students a variety of options for demonstrating their understanding, whether it's through written assignments, presentations, projects, performances, or even portfolios of work.
It's about giving them choices that allow them to showcase their strengths and interests.
Right.
Like, if a student is a gifted artist, maybe they could demonstrate their understanding of a historical event by creating a series of illustrations or a graphic novel.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that learning doesn't just happen in isolation. We can encourage collaboration and peer learning by incorporating group projects, discussions, and peer feedback into our assessments.
I love that idea. It's about creating a more dynamic and interactive learning environment where students are actively engaging with each other and with the material.
And, of course, we can't forget about the importance of feedback. We need to provide students with regular and meaningful feedback throughout the learning process, giving them opportunities to revise and improve their work.
So instead of just giving a grade at the end of a unit or a course, we're providing ongoing guidance and support along the way. And that feedback shouldn't just come from the teacher, right? We can also encourage students to provide feedback to each other and to reflect on their own learning progress.
You're absolutely right. Peer feedback can be incredibly valuable, and self-reflection is crucial for developing those metacognitive skills and fostering a sense of ownership over the learning process.
Okay, I'm seeing how all these pieces fit together to create a more holistic and learner-centered approach to assessment. But what about the elephant in the room, AI? How do we ensure academic integrity in a world where students can easily access AI tools to generate content?
That's a critical question, and Professor Elkington offers some insightful strategies for addressing this challenge. Instead of trying to police AI usage, he suggests focusing on designing assessments that are inherently resistant to AI manipulation.
So how do we do that? What kind of assessments are AI not so good at?
Well, AI is still pretty limited when it comes to tasks that require higher-order thinking skills. Creativity, personal reflection, and the ability to synthesize information from multiple sources.
So instead of asking students to write a generic essay on a historical event, which AI could easily churn out, we might ask them to create a podcast episode, design a website, or develop a marketing campaign that demonstrates their understanding of the topic in a more creative and authentic way.
That's a great example. By designing assessments that tap into these uniquely human capabilities, we can not only reduce the temptation to use AI, but also create more meaningful and engaging learning experiences for our students.
I love that. It's about shifting the focus from simply producing the right answer to developing the critical thinking skills and creative problem-solving abilities that students need to succeed in a world that's increasingly complex and unpredictable.
Exactly. And it's about being transparent with students about the role of AI in education and the ethical implications of using it for academic purposes. We need to help them understand that using AI to complete assignments isn't just about cheating. It's about undermining their own learning and development.
It's about fostering a culture of academic integrity where students feel supported and empowered to do their best work, knowing that their efforts are valued and that their learning is the ultimate goal.
That's a great way to sum it up. Now, I know this is a lot to take in. Implementing flexible assessment is a journey, not a destination. And it requires ongoing reflection, experimentation, and collaboration. But the benefits for our students are undeniable. They're huge. And I think, when we think about, student learning outcomes and, how we really think about assessing those, it really does make you think about how we're going to be approaching this. So, it's not just about can they regurgitate the information? It's about have they developed the skills and the competencies that they need.
Right. And are they able to apply those in a meaningful way?
Exactly. And, I think that's one of the things that Professor Elkington also talks about is this idea of assessment for learning, which, we mentioned earlier, but it's really about providing those opportunities for students to practice, to get feedback, to revise their work, and to really develop that deeper understanding.
So it's not like a one and done kind of thing.
No, it's a process and it's a cycle. And it's about helping students to see that learning is a journey, not just a destination.
Right. It's about developing those habits of mind.
Exactly. And, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this approach is that it really puts the onus on the educator to be more intentional about assessment. It's not just about, throwing a test at the end of a unit and seeing what sticks. It's about really thinking about the learning outcomes you want students to achieve and then designing assessments that actually measure those outcomes.
Right. So it's about aligning those assessments with your learning objectives.
Exactly. And, one of the things that Professor Elkington also talks about is this idea of authenticity in assessment. So it's not just about, giving students a multiple choice test. It's about giving them tasks that are actually relevant to the real world and that allow them to apply their knowledge and skills in a meaningful way.
So like instead of asking them to write a 5-paragraph essay about the Civil War, maybe you could have them create a documentary or a podcast.
Yeah.
Or even like design a museum exhibit.
Exactly. Those are all great examples. And I think, the key here is to be creative and to really think about what kinds of assessments will engage students and help them to demonstrate their understanding in a deep and meaningful way.
I'm really starting to see how this shift in assessment can really benefit students, especially when it comes to preparing them for a future that's so uncertain, like we were talking about earlier.
Right, because the jobs of the future may not even exist yet. So we need to be equipping students with the skills and the mindsets they need to adapt and to learn and to thrive in any environment.
And I think this approach to assessment can really help us do that.
Absolutely, because it's not just about memorizing facts. It's about developing those critical thinking skills, those problem-solving skills, the ability to communicate effectively. All of those things that are going to be essential for success in the 21st century.
And it's about fostering that love of learning, that curiosity, that drive to keep exploring and growing.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, that's what we really want for our students.
Right, to be lifelong learners.
Absolutely. And I think, Professor Elkington really hits the nail on the head when he talks about the importance of student agency in this whole process. So it's not just about the teacher dictating what students need to learn and how they need to be assessed. It's about giving students a voice and a choice in their own learning.
So it's about creating a more student-centered learning environment.
Exactly. And that can look different in different contexts. But I think the key is to be open to new ideas, to be willing to experiment, and to really listen to our students.
Right, because they're the ones who are at the heart of this whole thing.
Exactly. And, one of the things that I find really inspiring about this approach to assessment is that it really challenges us to rethink our role as educators. We're not just dispensers of knowledge anymore. We're facilitators, we're guides, we're mentors.
Right, we're partners in learning.
Exactly. And I think that's a much more empowering and fulfilling way to think about our work.
Absolutely. And, I think it's also important to acknowledge that this shift in assessment, it's not going to be easy.
No, it's going to take time and effort and a willingness to embrace change.
And it's going to require us to really examine our own beliefs about teaching and learning.
But I think it's a challenge that's worth taking on because the potential benefits for our students are enormous.
And, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
It is. And, I think Professor Elkington's presentation really gives us a lot to think about and a lot to work with as we move forward in this journey of transforming assessment.
Absolutely. And, it's clear that the future of assessment is full of exciting possibilities.
It is. And I think it's a future where assessment can actually be a source of joy and inspiration for both students and teachers.
I love that idea. Assessment as a source of joy.
Yeah, why not? I mean, it doesn't have to be this dreaded thing. It can be something that celebrates learning. And that helps students to see their own progress and potential.
And speaking of progress, I'm seeing a few questions in the chat about how to actually implement these ideas in the classroom. Like, what are some practical strategies for making assessment more flexible and student-centered?
Well, that's a great question. And, I think there are a lot of different approaches you can take. But one thing that I think is really important is to start small. You don't have to overhaul your entire curriculum overnight.
Right, like maybe just pick one unit or one assignment to experiment with.
Exactly. And then you can kind of build from there. Another thing that I think is really helpful is to collaborate with colleagues, share ideas, get feedback, and, learn from each other's experiences.
That's so important because we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. And, there are also a lot of great resources available online. So do your research, find what works for you, and don't be afraid to experiment.
I think that's great advice. Don't be afraid to experiment.
And, one last thing I would add is that it's really important to be patient. This is a process, and it's going to take time to see the results.
But it's a journey worth taking.
It is. And I think, if we're committed to creating a more equitable, engaging and empowering learning experience for all students, then this shift in assessment is essential.
And one of the things that Professor Elkington talks about that I think is really important is that this isn't just about changing the way we assess students. It's about changing the way we think about learning itself.
Right. It's about moving away from this idea of learning as a linear process where, you start at point A and you end at point B, and embracing this more holistic view of learning where it's seen as a journey, as an exploration, as a lifelong pursuit.
I love that. Learning as a lifelong pursuit.
Yeah. And I think, if we can instill that love of learning in our students, then we've done our job.
Absolutely. And, we've covered a lot of ground today. But I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that assessment doesn't have to be this scary thing.
No, it doesn't. It can actually be a really powerful tool for learning and growth.
And, it can be a way to celebrate student achievement.
Exactly. And, I think if we can shift our mindset from seeing assessment as a punishment to seeing it as an opportunity, then we can really transform the learning experience for our students.
And it really makes you think about, what we're truly trying to achieve in education.
Yeah, it's not just about filling students' heads with facts. It's about helping them to develop into well-rounded individuals who can think critically, solve problems, and make a positive impact on the world.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that Professor Elkington emphasizes is that assessment plays a key role in this process.
Yeah.
Because the way we assess students sends a powerful message about what we value and what we believe is important.
That's so true. And, if we're constantly assessing students on their ability to memorize and regurgitate information, then that's what they're going to focus on.
Right. They're going to prioritize rote learning over deep understanding.
Exactly. But if we assess them on their ability to think critically, to be creative, to solve problems, then those are the skills they're going to develop.
And those are the skills they're going to need to succeed in a world that's constantly changing.
Absolutely, because the jobs of tomorrow might not even exist yet.
So we need to be preparing students for a future that we can't even imagine.
And I think this shift in assessment is a really important step in that direction.
It's about moving away from this idea of assessment as a gatekeeper.
Right, where it's used to sort and rank students.
And embracing this idea of assessment as a compass.
Where it's used to guide and support students on their learning journey.
I love that analogy, assessment as a compass.
Because it's about helping students to find their own path and to navigate the challenges they'll encounter along the way.
And one of the things that Professor Elkington talks about that I think is really interesting is this idea of co-creating assessments with students.
Oh, yeah, that's a really powerful idea.
So instead of just telling students what they're going to be assessed on, we involve them in the process.
Right. We ask for their input on what they think is important to learn and how they think they can best demonstrate their understanding.
And that not only gives students a sense of ownership over their learning, but it also helps to ensure that the assessments are relevant and engaging.
Absolutely, because students are more likely to be invested in something that they've had a hand in creating.
And they're more likely to learn from it.
Exactly. And, I think this approach also really fosters that sense of trust and respect between teachers and students.
Right, because it shows students that we value their voices.
And that we see them as partners in the learning process.
And I think that's really important, especially in today's world.
Where students are bombarded with information from all sides, and they need to be able to critically evaluate that information and make their own decisions about what to believe and what to do.
Absolutely. And, we've talked a lot about the theory behind flexible assessment, but I think it's also important to talk about the practical side of things.
Right, like how do we actually implement these ideas in the classroom?
Exactly. And, one of the things that Professor Elkington suggests is to start by looking at your existing assessments.
And asking yourself some key questions.
Like, are these assessments aligned with my learning objectives?
Are they providing students with opportunities to demonstrate their understanding in a variety of ways?
Are they giving students feedback that is timely, specific, and actionable?
And are they fostering a culture of learning and growth in my classroom?
Those are all great questions to consider.
And once you've taken a good look at your existing assessments, you can start to think about ways to make them more flexible and student-centered.
And there are lots of different strategies you can use.
Right, like offering students choice in assessment topics or formats, incorporating self-assessment and peer feedback, and using technology to facilitate personalized learning.
And, the key is to find what works best for you and your students.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
And, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have, and I think it's clear that the future of assessment is full of possibilities.
It's a future where assessment is seen as an integral part of the learning process.
And where it's used to empower students to reach their full potential.
And, if you're interested in learning more about flexible assessment, we encourage you to check out Professor Elkington's online course. You can find a link to that in the show notes.
Absolutely. And we'd also love to hear your thoughts on this topic, so please leave a comment below and share your experiences and insights.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time, keep learning and keep questioning.